How's everybody doing? You having a good Conscious Life Expo weekend? Good, I'm so glad. My name's Shima Moore, I'm the co-founder. So happy to welcome you. How many of you are here the first time? Love it. Thank you for coming, and all of you who have been here before, thank you for coming back and bringing your friends and family, because that's how we get the word out. And if you've noticed, this year, the word has gotten out, right? So thank you. We really, really appreciate it, because let's face it, without you, there's no us, right? We're a community. And this is an opportunity to come together. And our next presenter is somebody who I originally met online, probably like most of us have here, right? And during COVID especially, oh my gosh, right, his weekly interviews on Astrology Hub, but just in general, I mean, on YouTube, just all these great things at the Seattle Coffee, in Seattle, the coffee house up there. And just this weekly, Patreon, you get your mid-month reports and stuff. Astrology is the way to go to really see what's happening. When they talk about the weather, that's the weather I'm interested in, right? Yeah, right. So you're going to have a wonderful evening in store for you, because as it says, it ain't your grandma's astrology, and this ain't your grandma's astrologer. This is the guy who's got the skinny on everything. He was even on the George Norrie panel. It was time to bring astrology into the sort of mainstream there, right? But have an astrological perspective on what the heck's going on. All these people are talking about things. Let's have an astrological perspective on it. And there's nobody that I know that could do it better than Rick Levine. So put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Master Astrologer Rick Levine. Knock him dead.
Knock him alive.
When I said that, I thought,
knock him alive. Don't knock him dead. Does this work? So, as many of you know, and those of you who attended the talent show heard a couple of my poems, that if I didn't have to make a living being an astrologer, I would be a poet. I am a poet, but I would just read and write poetry. And I want to open with a very short poem that, to me, as also a closet musician, has music to it. And if you can imagine the waltz that's played by a calliope on those big organs, and as you're going on the ponies up and down, I think of Joni Mitchell's song, "We're All Captives on the Carousel of Time," and you hear the calliope going, and that's the cosmic music that plays in the background. It plays in the back of my mind. Hold on, technical stuff. That should be okay sitting there for a moment. And it goes like this, short poem. The earth, it turns another round. I listen to the heavenly sound. My heart is tender from the night as footsteps walk into the light. The moon turns round the earth once more. The waves, they beat upon my shore that once was barren. Now tides rise and brings to me my hard-earned prize. The planets wander round the sky. I watch in awe and wonder why the meaning here and meaning there is the same and lays truth bare. The all-powerful clicker. So I noticed that in the program they changed my title. I had a title and a subtitle. And my title was, "It Ain't Your Grandma's Astrology." But the subtitle was Astrology in the Roaring 2020s. And that became the title because I think the thought was that, we got ahead of myself there. The thought was that somehow It Ain't Your Grandma's Astrology might be a combination of ageist and sexist. And it's neither, and I'll get there in just a moment. But this is probably, or perhaps not, the event that you think it's going to be, because I'm really not going to be talking about the trines and sextiles and the conjunctions and the eclipses and the Uranus, the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, or Jupiter moving into Gemini, or whatever else is going on. I'll reserve that for tomorrow's workshop. And plus, there's a YouTube that I've done online. My YouTube channel, for those of you who don't know, is just simply youtube.com/@, which is the new YouTube thing, @ Rick Levine. And I have a live presentation that was at, where's Shima? She's still here. Soul Food Coffee House in Redmond, on the astrology of 2024. And rather than focusing on the day-to-day or month-to-month astrology, what this talk is really designed to be is to talk about it. This ain't your grandma's astrology. Astrology that was practiced 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, is different than the astrology that we are getting to explore and move into these days. But in order to do that, in order to talk about where we are, we have to talk about where we're coming from and, of course, where we are in the moment so that we can determine where we are going. Grant Louie, who I think I will reference later on in this talk, was a tenured English professor at Dartmouth College who quit his academic career to become a full-time astrologer in the, I think in the late 1930s. And Grant Louie said that prophecy is simply knowing the history and following a trajectory. Now, of course, the problem is that without astrology, most people don't have the facility of knowing the history based upon cycles that are invisible to them unless they knew astrology. But first, before we move into the material, we have to talk about the ageism and sexism. So, about grandma ageism. All right, first of all, William Blake, one of my main metaphysical mentors, English mystic poet, artist, engraver, in his very important book, which I often reference in my teachings, which was his first of his prophetic works, it's called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And in it he said, because he was taking these journeys into the hell realms and then writing about it, and I could talk about this for 2 hours, and I can't because I only have 90 minutes. But in it, he writes that for me to describe the shapes of the buildings and so on there, that wouldn't give you an understanding of the hell realms or of hell. But if I give you their proverbs, that can really help you understand them. And some of the proverbs, some of Blake's proverbs from hell are known. One is, I can't think of Jim Morrison, who hit one of his favorite Blake quotes was, "The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom." Now, that is a William Blake quote from the same little sequence. Blake wrote, "The hours of folly can be measured by the clock, but those of wisdom no hands can measure." And it goes on for pages. Anyhow, one of my favorite of that whole sequence, because it describes my life, is I keep looking to see the thing over the screen over there, and I just get blinded. I have to remember to look this way. The quote from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell is, "If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise." And it kind of describes my life. I mean, I'm just standing in the same place, for close to 50 years. Well, actually, more than 50 years now. I'll be 75 next month, or in a month and a half. Made it this far so far. Yeah, living isn't something to be applauded. It's how you live. Anyhow, so my point here, though, is that this is not ageism, because I respect age, because it's the only way to persist. Is to in fact grow older. William Blake's another one of his works was actually called Songs of Innocence and Experience, which is a similar theme. Okay, so here's the deal. If anyone's cell phone rings, I get to answer it, and you don't want me to answer your cell phone. Trust me. Trust me, he said. Okay, so innocence and wisdom, and that is that when we learn something new, when we walk into a new relationship, we have this sense of innocence and excitement and wonder, but eventually the bright things turn dark, and those dark things go into plutonic deaths and rebirths and regenerations, and we become wise. And so, again, I'm just kind of giving you a sense that because I'm talking about Grandma's astrology, I'm not dissing Grandma, but I would like to say that I think it's really important to hire millennials while they still know everything. Because as we grow older, those things that we knew the most and the most fundamental and the most important eventually will be destroyed and need to be rebirthed. I was going to say something else about that. And also I find it quite ironic that I'm up here talking about, I'm dissing Grandma's astrology when compared to many astrologers running around today, I might as well be their grandma, sexism aside. I'm not sure why this came up on this slide. I did some rearranging, but I think that, it is. I mean, I understand why I put it here, because it's while we're innocent, we know everything. And yet, I, for years, have been telling potential clients who call with a question that they've got a wrong number, or they send an email to a wrong location because they're looking for an answer, and they want the answer astrologer, and I'm, unfortunately for them, the question astrologer. I won't answer your question. In fact, you can't pay me enough or love me enough to get me to answer a question for you, and I'll tell you the reason why. It's because I'm really good at answering questions. And if I answer your question, that stops your questioning. If I answer your question, that stops your questioning process. And we create reality by the dialogues that we create while we question. This is why we ask questions. And so if you come to me as a client or a student, the last thing I want to do is stop your questioning process. And so all of this is just my rationalization for why I'm talking about It Ain't Your Grandma's Astrology. So the other piece is that it's really important to understand that astrology as we know it is ultimately totally built upon a gender bias. In fact, it's important to understand that astrology, and I've said these exact same words many times, astrology was written by guys for guys. Now, it's important to also understand that the feminine part of the species, women, were way intuitively in touch with what became a masculine-based science of astrology. So this, again, is not about saying, hey, guys discovered the connection to the cosmos. No, guys got it secondhand from the women that they were with. But that's the point here, is that we have to understand that for thousands of years, astrology was totally gender biased. In fact, most of the names of the important techniques that astrologers use when calculating charts, like the ways in which someone divides the circle up into 12 houses, most of these names are named after Catholic monks. Campanus, Regiomontanus, Porphyry, Placidus. These are all names of systems that astrologers go, so what house cusp system do you use? Oh, I use Marinus. Well, Marinus and Placidus, they were all monks. So guys writing about astrology for guys. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about Rob Hand in a few minutes. But Rob Hand, who I refer to as the academic dean of astrology on the planet, smart guy. Rob wrote his PhD thesis, and his PhD is in ancient history. And this is a guy who wrote the main textbooks that many modern astrologers use. And at age 60, he went back to college to get his PhD in ancient history. So where did he go? Catholic University. Well, I mean, he said, if you want to learn ancient history, learn it from someone who's still living in ancient times, the Catholic Church. Anyhow, his PhD, his doctoral thesis was on the church's use of astrology in medieval warfare. Okay, so we got a system that was written by guys, and that there is and has been a very odd and ironic gender imbalance in the astrology world. 20, 30 years ago, when I would go to a conference, the conference would be pretty much, well, maybe 75% women, and maybe a quarter of the participants in a conference would be male. When I do some of my retreats, sometimes in a group of 40 students, there'll be 2 or 3 guys. Now, that has changed significantly recently, but that is interesting when you realize those same conferences 30 years ago that were almost all women, the teachers were almost all men. Something's wrong with that. I mean, I've actually talked to groups that were 85% women, and always, it's like the elephant in the room to me, I have to address the fact that something's wrong with the fact that I'm a guy and I'm standing here, teaching the party line, so to speak. And I'm okay with that, but we have to be aware of it because it's an important piece of astrology today and what's going on in the astrology world. And just to recap, astrology was written by guys for guys. In fact, most people, when they think of Saturn, they think of the Grim Reaper. They think of an old guy. They think of Father Time. And yet, Saturn was just as the sign Capricorn is a feminine sign. Capricorn is the sign where Saturn primarily lives. Every planet lives in a sign. And yet we have the concept of the crone, who is the old wise woman. And the wisdom tradition prior to the patriarchy taking over was largely held by the women. Benjamin Franklin, when he was writing the American Constitution, was modeling a lot of it after the Iroquois 5 nations, later 6 nations, and where basically the major decisions were made by women. That part did not make it into, well, that's another story. But see, so it's just important to understand that the astrology that we're taught, the astrology that we get, is not necessarily the astrology that's useful today because we are undergoing such dramatic and important transitions. So, secondly, or next, astrology has a PR problem. So this youth, this young 15, 16-year-old guy goes into his confession and he sits down and the first thing he says to the priest, he goes, "Father, before we continue, I need to just make sure you know I don't believe in God." And the priest says, "Oh, that's fine. I don't believe in God either." let's go on. And the kid's now shook up. He goes, well, what do you mean you don't believe in God? He goes, well, I don't believe, the priest responds, well, I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in. And when people tell me I don't believe in astrology, same thing. Cool. I don't believe in that shit either. You know, it's stupid. And they go, what's stupid? The astrology that you don't believe in is stupid because that's not the astrology that I do. Are you with me here? Historically, astrology has been excluded, and I can't use the word excluded without thinking of Charles Fort, who wrote a book called The Book of the Damned, bestseller, New York Times in 1922 or 23. And the opening line of The Book of the Damned was, by the damned, I mean the excluded. Ooh. Basically, by the way, when Pluto was demoted from planet to minor planet, and astrologers were all totally upset, I was celebrating because Pluto gains power when he's damned. Because Pluto's the lord of the underworld. And how do you make the underworld less powerful? You go to therapy and you learn what's in your unconscious. You take the light and you shine it into the unknown. When Pluto was a planet, he was being known, and by the damned, I mean the excluded. When Pluto was excluded, he gained power. Anyhow, historically, there have been many attempts to damn, to exclude astrology, to put it on the outside, and yet it's kind of like that wart that doesn't matter how many times we get it burned off and cut off and whatever, it just keeps growing back. And I do find it interesting that astrology may be the only thing that I can think of that science and religion agree with, or they agree about, and that is that they both are absolutely convinced that astrology needs to be eliminated for different reasons, but important reasons. I mean, science, because it blows everything that they thought was about what was the basis of science. We'll get to that in a few minutes. And religion was more less obvious, but definitely stated. I mean, going back to Thomas Aquinas, who was an astrologer early in his life, but wrote terrible diatribes against astrology. Why? Because it was a political issue. The church loses power if you go to the guy living at the edge of town who is basically now your intermediary between life here and the divine proportion. So, and for the record, there's nowhere anywhere in the Catholic canons that say astrology doesn't work. Nothing. They just say don't do it. And the Vatican, it's well known that the Vatican has like the largest astrological library in the world. And until about post-Medici's, until about 1500, every pope was either a practicing astrologer or had a staff of them in his high-level advisors. So that's another whole deep dive. But astrology certainly has a PR problem. In fact, even going back to the late 1400s, is that right? Late 1500s, when Johannes Kepler was doing his stuff, he wrote a book called Tertium Inter Venus, which roughly translates into the third person in between. The third man in the middle is the way you see it translated into English. And it was basically a book about how astrology shouldn't necessarily, how astrology was caught in the middle between this world of old, worn out, ancient superstitions and what was then more modern, mathematically oriented science. And I don't know if you've ever heard the term, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It comes from that book where Kepler wrote, when considering the ancient blasphemies that are contained within the superstitions of astrology, I caution modern men, back to that again, modern men, as they're delving into the new realms, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I love Deepak Chopra's line. Every now and again I hear a quote that I go, I wish I thought of that. Deepak Chopra once said that modern science suffers from the belief, from the belief in the ancient superstition of materialism. Modern science suffers from their belief in the ancient superstition of materialism. All right. And then we have, back to the PR problem, we have the mixed blessing of sun sign astrology. Now, in the spirit of full disclosure, I wrote 8 years of mass market Barnes & Noble books called Your Astrology Guide, 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, 8 years, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, that were accompanied by the 12 little books for each of the sun signs. And I also wrote a daily horoscope column for 20 years that, if you read your horoscope online, chances are I authored it, whether my name was there or not. 10 to 20 million readers a day. The column was distributed on AOL, MySpace, Huffington Post, Google, Yahoo, LA Times, blah, 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 blah. So I'm not going to diss sun sign astrology, but that's what most people think astrology is. And I love Chris Brennan's comment that sun sign astrology is the gateway drug to natal or real astrology. And like many people, the first book I ever read was Linda Goodman's Sun Signs. So sun sign astrology is not bad, but it's also part of astrology's PR problem. All right, we need to move on. So I'm going to zip through this really quickly because we have newer, more exciting material to get to. But the fact is that to know where we are, we need to know that astrology has been around for as long as humans have, marking the changes of the moon on bones. And in ancient Egypt and in Mesopotamia, this is the origins of what we call modern astrology. And it came to a kind of a fruition around what's called the Hellenistic period, the Greek Empire, and a lot of astrology that is practiced today is based upon, almost all astrology, based upon the first horoscopes that were created in this Hellenistic period. I'm going to have more to say about that in a few minutes. But then there was a bit of a fracture between the East and the West, and there's a lot of astrology that is contained in the ancient Vedas, the Hindu tradition, sometimes referred to as Vedic astrology. The Sanskrit word or the Hindi word is Jyotish, which actually translates into science of light. And then we move more through the Judeo-Christian period of time where astrology became more infused in the Western tradition. And yet for about 500 or 600 years, the knowledge of ancient astrology was held by the Arabs. And a lot of important modern astrology is based upon the centers of learning, while Europe was in its dark ages that were in places that are now modern Iran and Iraq and even northern Africa. But all of this is part of the tradition that goes up to the Middle Ages. Again, there was practicing astrology during that period of time. But it really wasn't until the Renaissance in Florence in the mid-15th century, 1460s to 1490s maybe, that astrology just exploded into the Western world, largely because of the work of a man named Marsilio Ficino, who was the guy who translated Plato from Greek into Latin. There's another 2-hour deep dive that we're not doing right now. But this is where it really began to flourish, and this is the astrology, incidentally, that both Johannes Kepler in particular was studying, and of course, Kepler being one of the greatest astrologers of the last millennium. And then we hit the Age of Enlightenment, that Rob Hand refers to as the Age of Endarkenment, because at that point in time, we had this overwhelming infusion of the printed word, and I'm going to get back to this in a few minutes, and the patriarchy establishes itself with a huge level of dominance. By the way, you're welcome to take pictures of any of these, but I have a better offer for you, and that is that if you send me an email and ask, I will send you a link where you can download the entire PowerPoint so that you have all of these that you can do whatever you want with. I don't care. And I'll have cards that I'll give you that have my email is easy. It's rlevine at star IQ, think smart star.iq.com. But I'll have business cards here afterwards. But if you send me an email, I'll send you the entire, all these files. If you want to take a picture, though, you're welcome to. The Age of Enlightenment was very problematic for astrology as it hit the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, because the Age of Enlightenment basically excluded astrology on every level. It was when astrology was kicked out of the universities. I mean, you go back in time, every modern practicing physician takes the Hippocratic Oath, right? But they don't understand that the Hippocratic Oath that they take is the first of 2 paragraphs, actually a longer piece of work. But the second paragraph says, the Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. And, the second paragraph says that no one should be allowed to practice medicine without knowledge of the stars. So this selective memory is very important here. But the Age of Enlightenment was when we had, Isaac Newton mechanically saying, we can understand everything. Descartes saying, give me enough mathematics and formulas and I can know everything there is to know about the universe. Sorry, dude. Descartes had I always say 15 planets, but I don't think there are that many. I think he had 7 planets in Aries, and he was an important guy, but he didn't get it. He got it from that standpoint of what wave they were riding on. But the problem is that in the Age of Enlightenment, and since then, astrology has been excluded from the the current academic processes. That if you wanted to study astrology, you could not do it in academia. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that anything called sun sign astrology ever appeared. There was no such thing as sun sign astrology, what's your sign, until Alan Leo began writing what was called then a horoscope. And I should say just in passing that a horoscope, although I wrote a horoscope column for 20 years, a horoscope actually has the same etymological derivation as the word telescope or microscope. The word scope comes from a Greek word scopus, to view or to see. And a microscope sees small. A far sees far. Telescope sees far. Horo is the Greek word for hour. A horoscope sees the hour. That's all it is. And in fact, in order to see the hour, you have to see what's rising on the eastern horizon, because that's what changes hour by hour. The sun doesn't change signs. The Saturn changes signs every 2.5 years. But what changes every hour is Saturn on the western horizon. Oh, now it's invisible. So the hour marker, the view of the hour, the horoscope, is actually the ascendant. If you want to be a real wise ass and be grounded in the fact that you're smarter than whoever is asking you the question, and they say, what's your horoscope? You tell them your rising sign. Oh, my horoscope is Gemini, or my horoscope is this, because the word horoscope actually means ascendant or rising sign. And we talked a little bit about Alan Leo and sun signs. But as we moved into the 20th century, theosophy and astrology began combining. We had the work of the esoteric astrologers, Madame Blavatsky and Alice Bailey. And it was really the move into the 20th century and the advent of depth psychology. I know that when you say Freud in front of a group of, conscious people, most of them go, he didn't understand, he didn't get it. And that's so far from the truth, because if we didn't have Siggy, we wouldn't have projection, we wouldn't have resistance, we wouldn't have ego, we wouldn't have unconscious, we wouldn't have dreams as a form of the unconscious communicating with the conscious, we wouldn't have Carl Jung, we wouldn't have growth and depth psychology, we wouldn't have talk psychology. So don't give me that, oh, Freud was wrong crap. Freud, again, this is another 2-hour lecture, but Freud basically worked his way into the unconscious in a way that no one had from the direction that he did. But it was that movement into depth psychology and Jung's fascination with astrology that really has moved astrology into some place that's very different than the astrology was prior to the mid-20th century. And, whoops, I thought I had another piece there. Nope, I guess not. And in the 20th century, there were some brilliant astrologers. Does anyone know Evangeline Adams' name? Evangeline Adams was a New York City astrologer, brilliant practitioner, and a bit of a media darling. And she predicted a fire in the Waldorf Astoria the day before it occurred, and it occurred. And she was put on trial because of what's called blue laws that are outdated. And she was tried in a New York City court for practicing fortune telling, which was illegal. And in her trial, which she was basically acquitted, she was acquitted because she testified on her own behalf. And she told the judge, well, look, if you want to understand what I'm doing, give me someone's birth date and I'll show you and I'll give you an example. And the judge gave Evangeline Adams the birth date of his son. And she basically told him that this person, had died on a certain date. This is astrology that I'm not sure is astrology, but doesn't matter. The fact is that the judge was stunned and let her go. But the important thing in that trial was that some of her clients were deposed, and one of her clients was a guy named J.P. Morgan. And if you've ever heard the quote, and this is a real quote, and this is documented, if you've ever heard the quote, millionaires use their brains, billionaires use their astrologers. That was from the recorded court deposition of J.P. Morgan in the Evangeline Adams trial. So astrology has been around, but it's still been on the outside. In the 1930s and 40s, Grant Louis wrote a couple of books that became mass market books, Astrology for the Millions. It's still in print. It's still an amazing book. But astrology wouldn't go away. And then, of course, Dane Rudhyar, who was a theosophist, wrote, I don't know how many books, 10, 15 books on astrology in the 1960s, and became associated with astrology, what we now call humanistic astrology, kind of like astrology and spirituality. Again, the two were not connected until the 1960s. And, of course, Linda Goodman Sunshine in the late 1960s, publishing Anomaly, not only a bestseller, but she became the first author to ever sign a $1 million pre-publishing advance contract. But again, so many people got into astrology at that time because of that. Now, moving up a little bit further, we have Rob Hand, who I consider to be a good friend and an associate. And Rob actually, in the 1960s, wrote text that were 300 words on each of the various combinations of transits, of each planet transiting by angle to planets in someone's natal chart. That was done under contract for a company called Para Research, and a terminal was placed in Grand Central Station in New York City. And for, I don't remember how much it was, $10 or $15, you basically were able to put in your birth date, your place and time. It would calculate your chart and then spit out a 20-page report based upon your real planets. That was the first publicly available computerized astrology. Now, in our day and age, anyone can go on the internet and in 30 seconds can find 10 sites to calculate their chart and tell them something about themselves. But this is a modern phenomenon. That Rob Hand's books, Planets in Transit, Planets in Youth, and Planets in Love, are on the shelf of most practicing astrologers. They're considered the modern classics. In the 1980s, Rob and two friends of his, actually Rob, who's a single person, started an organization called ARHAT, the Association for the Retrieval of Historical Astrological Texts. And ARHAT originally was set out to translate some of the old Greek texts into modern English that had never been translated before. And arguably, the organization that was created from ARHAT called Project Hindsight became the first crowdsourcing company in modern times that I know of. And what they did was they started this organization that hired translators that were astrologers. And if you were a Project Hindsight participant, you paid like $5 a month or something like that. And every month you would get the latest of whatever they were translating. And they translated over the course of a decade and a half. They translated works from ancient Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Hebrew, Aramaic, and this has changed modern astrology because most of these texts had never been read in 2,000 years. And the ones that had been read, like Ptolemy, who was translated, who wrote the Tetrabiblos, which is considered to be one of the oldest astrology texts. Ptolemy was translated, but he was translated by academic translators who already knew astrology was bullshit, so they didn't make any attempt to make it understandable or to understand what was being said. So they went back and retranslated all of these works that were, trashed by modern academics who didn't know. And it was a multi-year project. It's still, Project Hindsight really changed the face of modern astrology and created what many astrologers call the Hellenistic revival. There are numbers of modern astrologers, and some of you probably listened to Chris Brennan's astrology podcast. Some of you may know Demetra George, who brought asteroids into a modern astrology. They and many other astrologers have really spent their astrology studies revisiting and relearning and translating and working these older techniques, creating a whole generation of astrologers coming into astrology in the past 10, 15 years. That was the astrology they learned. Now, that astrology wasn't even around when I came into astrology. It wasn't available. And it's fantastic and important, but it's also created a problem. And this is really what we're here to talk about today. The problem it created is that there is a part of a whole generation of astrologers who are living 2,000 years ago in their astrology and actually have all of the patriarchal biases that were built into the system back around the birth of Jesus that are now here, which may or may not be as relevant. 1970s, enter the computer. So in the past, and I was doing astrology well before computers, and when I saw a client, it would take me, I'm good at math, and it would take me probably about 3 or 4 hours to calculate a chart and get ready for a client. And on top of that, I had all these charts, these books filled with tables that did all of the solving of spherical triangles and sines and cosines and all that shit that, although I'm good at math, I may not do that. I don't do that. But along came in, I think about 1976, maybe 75, a company called Digicomp. And again, until computers came along, pretty much the only people who had their charts done were wealthy people that could afford to pay an astrologer to spend a half a day calculating their chart. And on top of that, going back 500, 300 years ago, the only people that had their charts done from the birth of Christ all the way up until maybe the 1600s, the only people who had their charts done were royalty. Because it would take an astrologer weeks to calculate a chart. They would go out at night and do the sightings to figure out where the planets were. There were no books that were just tables that they could look that stuff up. So Digicomp came out with this astrological computer where you could just put in your birth date, place, time, and latitude and longitude and time zone, and boom, and out would come a chart. And it changed everything. But it was really, it was kind of like Pluto dipping into Aquarius. Astrologers thought, wow, this is the future. No, it was just the tip of the iceberg of a taste of what the future would be. But even as early as 77, 78, 79, there were astrologers developing software that's become more and more sophisticated. And the evolution of software has taken us up to where we are now. That gives us tools for data analysis that we didn't even have a clue about a couple of decades ago. Astro Data Bank was begun by a woman who, through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, collected tens of thousands of birth data on recipe cards. Name was Lois Rodden. And Lois was just an avid data collector. Well, I'm thinking this was probably around 2000, no, it was probably like 1997, that someone approached Lois, who was computer savvy, someone who had some financing, and together they basically took these 40, 50,000 recipe cards, entered them into a computer, did all the chart calculations, hired people to write biographies, and all of this is available for free right these days on astrodatabank.com. It's under the auspices of astro.com or Astrodienst, owned by a PhD physicist, Alois Treindl, who's just this very cool guy. And but you can go on to Astro Data Bank, and if you were wondering who your, the birth date or the chart for your favorite 16th century composer, it's there. And again, these are tools that the ancients couldn't even ever have possibly imagined. And of course, now with the internet and international community, things have really, really changed. And we moderners do a lot of astrology. Tomorrow during the workshop tomorrow afternoon at 2:00, I think. We're gonna be looking at the broad view, the more hands-on astrology of where we are now and where we're coming from and where we're going to, from a standpoint of actual mechanics of our individual lives. And what's important in astrology is relating things to history. Now, it was Johannes Kepler who first figured out the mathematics of being able to calculate where a planet was or where it will be. Until Johannes Kepler came along, the only way to know where a planet was to go out at night and look at it. And the tables, the mathematical tables that were available then were incredibly inaccurate. So it was Johannes Kepler who figured out that Jupiter and Saturn lined up every 20 years, and they did it a couple of degrees away from where they did it 60 years ago, 60 years prior. And he calculated back, and he realized that what's called the Star of Bethlehem was very likely a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, and that's another 2-hour dive that we're not doing right now. Because there's controversy around that, but it's very likely. But the point is that no astrologer could ever look at slow-moving outer planets and look at the history. Now, for a modern astrologer, I remember the day the World Trade Tower was bombed. Within an hour, I sat at my computer because I knew that there was a Saturn alignment with Pluto. Saturn and Pluto were opposed at that point in time. And I went into my computer and I typed Saturn, Pluto, conjunction, opposition, the year 200 BC to now, boom, hit a button. And as fast as my printer could print it out, I had a printout of every time Saturn and Pluto were in conjunction or opposition in the past 2,200 years. Boom. Then I threw that into an Excel spreadsheet, and then I went to the library because we didn't have internet yet. Or not functional like this, but I had reference books and whatever, and I and many other astrologers. This isn't something that I did, like myself. Realized, holy crap! Every time Saturn and Pluto align, there's huge, major global cultural shifts. Saturn and Pluto aligned by conjunction or opposition. At the Protestant Reformation, at the when Muhammad declared Mecca the state of Islam, when the Arabs came into Spain 5-7 centuries later, when they were kicked out. Within a week of the beginning of World War I, within a few days of India's independence and partition, within a few weeks of the World Trade Tower disaster, and within about 10 hours of the announcement of the Wuhan virus. Need I say more? The point is that we moderners have a different astrology than the ancients do, and that's really what we're talking about today. And with the internet and the proliferation of astrology on the web, astrology has no chance of dying out like it seemed like it might have been in the late 80s, when it just didn't seem like there was new blood coming into astrology. Because now every day, every week, I meet someone and we talk, and they go, "Oh yeah, I do astrology," and I go, "Oh yeah, we've never met." They're like, "No, but I've been studying since I was 9 years old because I read stuff on the internet." And there's a lot of good stuff on the internet. There's a lot of crap too, but now we're coming to the meat of where we are now, because this is the most important slide of today. And it's, before we looked at enter the computer, now we look at enter the quantum. Now, I want to spend a few minutes here talking about the huge shift that we are all experiencing, but that is impacting astrology so thoroughly that it's making the astrology of the 21st century a different animal than it was in the 19th or even in the early 20th century. Isaac Newton kind of set about a series of mechanics, an understanding of the mechanistic universe that is the predominant underpinning of what modern science has been. Isaac Newton came up with this idea that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. He didn't know it was karma, but it was Newton's laws of motion. And these billiard ball mechanics of cause and effect is what astrology has practiced, that if this planet does this to that planet, something happens. This means that, cause effect. This is the Newtonian paradigm. In the Newtonian paradigm, there was gravity, and gravity was a force that didn't get less the farther away you got from the source of it. It got less at an exponential rate, meaning that if you were 10 times farther away, it wasn't 10 times less, it was 10 times 10, 100 times less. So with gravity as the predominant glue to the universe, distance meant no impact, no effect, which of course means how can Pluto have any impact on my life? In the Newtonian paradigm, time was linear and an independent variable, meaning you could do an experiment, measure surface tension on something, and it would, or the speed at which something falls, and it would fall at 32 feet, it would accelerate at 32 feet per second every second. And that was a constant. And you could do it at 3 in the morning in winter or at 4 in the afternoon in the summer. You could do it in 1917 or in 1719. It didn't matter. It was always the same. Time was linear, meaning that every second was 1 second long. I call it tick-tock, Newton's clock. Every second, every tick was exactly the same. It didn't matter how much or how little happened. A second was a second. And then in Newton's paradigm, humans were separate from nature. There was an objective reality out there, the illusory objective reality that is separate from my consciousness. And of course, this then solidified the idea that humans were separate from nature and needed to fix it or overcome it. In the 20th century, the hardest core of all the hardcore sciences, physics, went belly up. It's soft-shelled. And here's the true meaning of Einstein's equation. E equals mc squared is actually energy equals milk times the amount of coffee squared. I made that shit up. Okay. In the quantum paradigm, cause and effect falls away. There's no such thing when you go into the microscopic realms. In the microscopic subatomic realms, you can't tell that when this billiard ball hits that billiard ball, it goes that way. For two reasons. Number one, there's no billiard balls. We'll get there in a minute. And number two, everything is based upon probability, functions of probability. This is important in modern astrology. In quantum physics, things very far apart have an ability to communicate with each other instantaneously as if something was traveling faster than the speed of light, and that is instantaneous. This is called non-locality, and it's very important to understanding why astrology now is totally fitting into the new scientific paradigm. Albert Einstein said, people like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. In quantum physics, it is believed that the universe, the cosmos, is intelligent. Let me say that again. The cosmos is intelligent. With or without our participation in it, with or without the participation of what we call animate life. The cosmos itself is intelligent. Quantum physics holds the understanding of what is called nonlinear time. Anyone who's ever experimented with plant medicine, or as in my day, we just called it acid, anyone who's had any form of psychedelic or entheogenic experience knows that, that an hour of processing, can take place in, in 3 or 4 seconds. And in fact, modern experimentalists tell us that what we perceive in our dreams to be a long, rambling, unfolding dream happens in a flash. So nonlinear time. A second is not a second. Some seconds last a week and other weeks last a second. In fact, Einstein once was asked, can you explain relativity to someone who's not a scientist? Then he said, yeah. He said, if you put your hand on a hot stove, a second seems like an hour, and if you're with a beautiful woman, an hour seems like a second. Yeah. We won't talk about the misogynistic part of Einstein. Selective filtering. And then we get to what I think is the most important piece of this, and that is what scientists call the particle wave duality. Does that mean anything to anyone? A handful of you? Okay. The particle wave duality is on some level really, really simple. And that is that we can observe that light propagates as if it's a wave. And yet, when we measure it, it seems to be a particle. Einstein's Nobel Prize was about his work on light as a photon. A photon is a packet or particle of light. By the way, did you hear about the photon who went to the hotel and to check in for a room, and he gets his room key, and the desk clerk says, do you need any help with your luggage? And the photon goes, no, I'm traveling light. So, sorry, I can't help it. Uranus rising in my chart. Okay, so the particle wave duality on one level is simple to explain. On another level, it's impossible to comprehend until you see what I'm going to show you. And I was actually at, I have a good friend, I haven't seen him in a few years, but Fred Wolf, the physicist in the movie What the Bleep. And Fred's been through all my quantum physics stuff, and so I know that it's real because he would say, this is good, this is interesting, no, this isn't right, you need to go back and read Schrodinger and read this book and read chapter, 4 and 5. He was vicious, not vicious, helpful. I was at Fred's 80th birthday party, and he came and grabbed me, and there were several very well-known physicists there, and he goes, Rick, I want you to go talk to these guys, tell them about the particle wave thing. I was like, no, these guys, it's like crazy. I'm not telling these no. But I have a very interesting perception on this. So back to this particle wave duality. There's this thing called the double slit experiment, and you can find a wonderful 3-minute thing if you go to YouTube and you do a search on Dr. Quantum Particle Wave or Fred Wolf. Because it's an animation that was done of this, and one of these days I'll capture it so I can play it. But it's very, very simple, and that is that if you take light and shine it through 2 slits, if light was particles, you could like little marbles, they would make two patterns on the wall opposite, and you can measure these little marbles, but when you actually shine the light, it doesn't do that. It makes what looks like the interference patterns from waves. So it appears that light is a particle, but it travels like a wave. I've got a couple things out of order here. I love Niels Bohr, who's the father of quantum physics, said prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. So we have this understanding about this particle wave thing, that light is a particle when we look at it, and it's a wave when we don't look at it. And quantum physicists will tell us that the observation pops the quantum wave function and it turns a wave into a particle, but then when we don't look at it, it goes back to being a wave, and it's how the hell does that happen? I do know, but most people would say, I don't know, but Heisenberg was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for what's called the uncertainty principle, which is fundamentally important to modern astrology, although most astrologers do not know this. Heisenberg wrote, the more precisely the position of a subatomic event, the more precisely the position is determined, the less precisely the momentum is known in this instant, and vice versa. What that means is the more you know about where an electron is, the less you know about where it's going. The more you know about where it's going, the less you know about where it is, and you cannot know where it is and where it's going at the same time. It's either or. I want everyone to do a really quick experiment with me. Uncross your legs. This is not going to be a long guided meditation or anything like that for those people who are adverse to that. Lift your right foot off the ground and keep it parallel, just an inch or two, and make circles clockwise. You remember clocks, those old things that used to have hands going around? All right, so just get that foot going clockwise. Try to keep the foot parallel, to the ground. And now, with your right hand, draw a big number 6 in the sky. The brain can't process time and space, particle and wave. It cannot process motion in this way at the same time. You snap one way or the other. Now, I want to spend a minute or two talking about the electromagnetic spectrum, and then we're going to bring this back around to astrology for the few punchlines in this. So we know that what we see in the world is based upon what we can perceive with our eyes. It's color. But what we don't really think about is that color is just this little tiny slit of this wide spectrum of frequencies that, in fact, that when we're looking at something and calling it red or green, we're looking at something that's 670 trillion cycles a second. And if it's faster, higher frequency, it becomes violet until it's so high frequency that it's ultraviolet. We can't see it. And then on the other end, if it's slows down to only like 400 trillion cycles a second or so, and it's red, slower than that, it becomes infra to red, which we can't see, but we can feel it as heat until we go lower and lower and lower. And so when we look at this full electromagnetic spectrum, we know that X-rays and gamma, all these rays or waves are all propagate differently. But at the lower end of the spectrum and the higher end of the spectrum, if you can remember back to your 9th grade science book, there's always these big question marks. Well, I want to remove one of those question marks. Because when you go octaves, octaves, and octaves lower than the lowest frequencies on the normal electromagnetic spectrum, you end up with what I call planet waves. Now, what the hell are planet waves? Well, here's the question. Are planets particles or waves? Astrologers for thousands of years have been measuring them as particles, like Einstein measuring light as a photon. When we do a chart, what sign are you? I'm a Vegetarius, or I'm a Crises, or whatever those signs are. No, when you say I'm a Virgo, you say the sun in my chart is at that position that we call 17 degrees of Virgo or whatever. The sun is a particle. When you look up at the sky and you see the full moon, you go, there's the moon. It's a particle. So we map a chart and we fill the chart with particles. But when we're not looking at that particle of the moon, it's rising and falling the tides. It's cycling at the rate of 13 cycles a year. Saturn is a particle. It's the ringed particle, but it's a particle. And yet when we're not looking at it, it's cycling at the rate, it's vibrating, it's humming at the rate of 3 beats a century. A little bit more than that, but about every 30 years. Pluto is cycling at the rate of 4 beats a millennium. But the planets that we measure are the particles in a particle wave duality. And it means that when we're looking at a particle and seeing it as a particle, that doesn't mean that it's still not moving as a wave. It's still a wave. We're just observing it in that moment and collapsing what's called the quantum wave function. So I would like to add to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle the concept of fate and free will, and I'll cycle back in this in just a moment. Actually, I'm going to go to this slide and come back. That you remember those old things on the SATs, hot is to cold, like up is to? All right. Particle is to wave as fate is to free will. It's absolutely 100% Loctite, this is a reality. In other words, fate and particle are at the same end of the spectrum, and free will and wave are at the same end of the spectrum. And the more precisely fate is determined, I'm just rewording Heisenberg, the less effective is free will in this instant and vice versa. If you go to see an astrologer who says, in 2 years you're going to have blah, 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 get the fuck out of there. Because this astrologer is locked into some Newtonian billiard ball cause and effect paradigm that's simply not the way the world works. This is the problem that I have with Hellenistic and ancient astrology traditions. Not that there's not I know that was a double or triple negative. Not that there's not, just double. Not that there's not a lot of very useful and important information that's come to us from these, a lot of techniques. There's a lot of good stuff. But this idea that this planet lined up with that planet means this. Or when Saturn conjuncts your moon, you're going to feel horrible and end a relationship and hate your mother. Or whatever. And so it's really important to make that distinction between fate and free will and particle and wave. And again, particle, this is just a replay. Okay, particles I call planets BFPs. Big fucking particles. But they're still particles. It's just a matter of scale. You see, one of the most important underpinnings of the astrological tradition is what's called, it comes from what's called the Emerald Tablet, which was allegedly written by this Egyptian character called Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes the Great 3 times. Hermes is communication. Hermes is Greek for Mercury, Latin. And in the Emerald Tablet, it says, most people know this simply as above, so below. As if the above created the below. If this is what's happening up there, it's cause and effect. As above, so below. But the second sentence in this is, it goes, the full, this is again like back to Hippocrates, where the important thing is eliminated. It's not just as above, so below. It's as above, so below. The within of things is as the without of things. You see, what we are is we are a vibrating intersection of the macrocosmic low frequency long waves and the microcosmic high frequency short rays, and where the microcosm and the macrocosm intersect and create nodes. Oh, what's a node? That's Latin for knot. And knots are created when waves cross each other at right angles. That's what a node is. In medicine, a node is a knot where the cells are tied up. That's the center of a mass. And so we are basically the nodal points of where the macrocosm and the microcosm meet. One doesn't cause the other because one is the other. The within and the without are one. And the illusion that creates Maya, the Hindu term for the veil that covers what things really are, is basically this illusion that this world is reality when this world is just where the very big and the very small intersect. And they intersect for each of us based upon the moment in space and time that we propagate, that we hold that perspective. So, last little piece on this. We have this idea, especially in astrology, the sun is in the center. We kind of moved from the earth center to the sun center. And we have the various planets going around the sun. However, that's not the reality. Here's the reality. We have, I think I need to start this little animation. Come on. What we have is we have the planets that look like they're going around the sun. Is this started? Come on. There we go. So we have the planets going around the sun, and they're all on their own little tilt. But what we don't realize is that the sun, with all of the planets going around it, that entire thing is actually tilted itself to the plane of the Milky Way galaxy by about 60 degrees. And in fact, the sun is moving faster in that direction, a couple of 100 kilometers an hour in that direction, with the planets moving around it. So the Earth does not return to where it was every year. It keeps up with the sun, and it creates this ongoing spiral. Are you with me here? Yeah. That's what the solar system is. And that entire spiral, which we're just, kind of taking a 360-degree perspective here of, the planets are creating spirals around the sun, but if you track the direction the sun is moving in, the sun itself is taking 230 million years to make a complete journey around the black hole, that source of intelligence or the center of the Milky Way galaxy with its own wobbles and so on. Now, this is a huge shift in how we think the world works. And why is this important? Well, it's important because of this book that was written, back in the 50s, I think, called The Theory of Celestial Influence by a guy named Rodney Collin. And in it, he described what he called the long body of the solar system. And he has that same picture kind of roughed out of the sun with the various planets making like a tail of a spiral around it. Now, the thing that's really significant here is that what this ends up looking like is what Nikola Tesla invented as a step-down transformer. That you take a central coil. The sun, if you speed it up, becomes the central filament, and the planets become like the coiled wires around the sun. And this is how you take incoherent energy, the sun, the solar core, putting out all this energy, and then you have Mars going bip, 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 like a laser, kind of cohering that energy, and in fact stepping down that energy to us here on Earth. And now we take our little dance into Nikola Tesla land, which is actually another, maybe 3-hour presentation. Tesla wrote, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. I actually was at the Tesla Museum in Belgrade, Serbia, and that's one of his coils that he actually made. So the point here ultimately is that astrology is not cause and effect, Newtonian particle-based cause and effect, billiard ball interactions. The idea of predicting the future is just stupid. I mean, I'm not saying that we don't ever predict the future. If I say I'm going to meet you at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening, I'm predicting the future. If I say that the sun's going to rise tomorrow, I'm predicting the future. There's a lot of ways in which we can predict the future, but to over-cohere the collapse of the quantum wave function is dangerous because it takes away the free will of the person that I'm talking to. So we have this whole idea of navigation versus prediction that is coming more and more a part of astrology, and that fate and free will actually coexist. When we work with charts, rather than looking at planetary points as individual points, to see them as fields of energy and as as moving cycles, but points on those moving cycles, and to interpret the aspects, the conjunctions, squares, oppositions, trines, sextiles, quintiles, septiles, noviles, semi-square, it goes on. But it's not about the locked-in geometry. It's about that geometry always changing and always moving and having patterns of resonance, because we, in fact, are resonating and resonant, self-aware, organic crystals that have been grown in supersaturated solutions of protein. That's what we are. And we're all the same and we're all different, the old snowflake thing. So again, we're looking at the concept of altering prediction of events into patterns of recurrence. Kepler, Pythagoras, music of the spheres. When we hear music, we hear things through our reality tunnel. We hear vibrations that occur in the hundreds to thousands of cycles a second. Planets are vibrating, but instead of at cycles a second, you tune a radio and you listen to 570 AM, that's 570 kilohertz, or 570,000 kilocycles every second. FM radio, 93.1, you're listening to 93.1 mega million cycles every second. Saturn is just 3 cycles every century. It's still hum, but we can't hear it with our ears, so instead we dance to it with our lives. But we're not perceiving it because it's infra, it's below, it's infrasensorial. All our senses are based upon frequency, vibration. I don't want to talk about the difference between Vedic astrology and, I just want to mention that Vedic astrology did use this kind of harmonic concept. And that the harmonics are about vibration rather than about points. And that in the 20th century, a British guy named John Addy began looking at these harmonic relationships outside of the you're a Taurus and I'm a Scorpio kind of signs. And that even in these times, David Cochrane has been doing work in what he calls vibrational astrology. And so what I'm trying to do here is point out a whole new wave of astrology that, in fact, is coming in. Now, I got one other concept to get to. I'm going to do this rather quickly. Has anyone here in the room heard of or know or read all 10 or 12 books of this guy named Marshall McLuhan? All right. So Marshall McLuhan in the mid and late 1960s was on the cover of all the major popular magazines and the newscasts. He was the media guru. He had something to say about everything in a way that no one ever thought about it. And one of his important books, many of you have probably heard the term "the medium is the message." Well, the title of his book was "The Medium is the Massage." And he was a Joycean scholar. He was a professor of literature at the University of Toronto. And he was a brilliant mind. And his whole concept was that the technology that we use to send and receive information is more important than the content of the information we're getting in that technology. That people who never read a book are different than people who read a book. People who grew up with televisions are different than people who weren't, because it alters the sense ratios. And there was this guy named Leonard Shlain who wrote a very important book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess. And it's about how this guy was a medical doctor, professor of surgery at Stanford. And he wrote this book about right, left brain, and how the right hand, left brain was basically magnified by the use of the alphabet technology, because the left brain processes linear thinking, whereas the right brain, which is the feminine side, the receptive, the artistic, the intuitive, and that has now come back alive after several hundred years of print technology, patriarchy. It's come alive because now we're in an electronic realm where it's more instantaneous. And again, it's another deep dive. We don't really have time for it. But the fact of the matter is we're standing on a cusp. I said in the astrology panel earlier, that the only two things you need to know about the future are the alphabetic AI and ET, because that's basically what's happening. We as a culture have flipped out. Our internal nervous system is no longer internal. It's external. We have an exonervous system. We can call it the World Wide Web. Actually, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin called it the noosphere, but it's an external nervous system. GPS, global positioning systems. I said this in the George Norrie panel. I have about 30 seconds to say it now, and that is in the next 10 to 20 years, we will see TPS become as common as GPS. TPS is temporal positioning systems. It may not look like it has anything to do with astrology, but by analyzing and having the computer in the sky know your birth date, place, and time, it'll say, no, wait 10 minutes. Okay, now. It won't tell you what, it'll tell you when. It won't tell you where you're going, it'll tell you when you're going. Temporal positioning systems. We live in a world with an exo database of intelligence. Things have changed. And I'm going to, and again, I know that this is probably not the lecture that you were preparing for, but the whole concept that I'm trying to get across is that astrology is not the same astrology that our parents, grandparents, their grandparents, or history has engaged. Like everything else in our culture, we are standing at a precipice. We're standing right on the edge, on the cusp, to use the Latin word. And things have changed, and things are changing. There are people who are ahead of the wave, Aquarians, and they're looking back and saying, what do I got to do to get people to accept this change and move with me? And then there are the Capricorns on the far end of the wave saying, I'm not going to change. I want the status quo. I want to make things great the way they were. I don't want to go there. Because it's based on Freudian infantile regression. We think when under pressure, we want to go back to our childhood when things were great, except they weren't. They sucked, for many of us, not everyone. Anyhow, so ultimately, bringing this all full circle is that we can talk all we want about what's out there. We can stretch our minds to Venus, Mars, Mercury, Saturn, Jupiter, Eris, black holes, quasars, as far as we want. All good. But unless you do something in your immediate environment, don't whine about your chart if you're having problems in communications with the person that you're sharing a bed with. Get that right first. In other words, there's this thing of think cosmically, but we have to act locally. Thanks. I hope this ride was fun. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Logistics, we need to get out of here like soon, but I will be